Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to today's newspaper review. We'll start with the Daily Trust. On the Daily Trust newspaper, a woman stated how her only daughter died in Kano school. You continue reading on page 5 of the newspaper. Then at the top of that newspaper, governors as stated that state police must align with federalism and citizens' rights. The full story is on page 6 of the newspaper. Then Ireti Kingibe confirmed forgery allegations that led to the suspension of Natasha. You get the full story on page 10 of the newspaper. At the bottom of that newspaper, retired generals says that government must be proactive as a result of the insecurity. You continue reading on page 5 of that same newspaper. Then at the bottom of the newspaper, NEC approves 83 billion naira to tackle flooding, climate emergency. You get the full story on page 6 of that newspaper. Then on page 6 of the newspaper as well, Nigeria, according to minister reports, Nigeria may sanction South African firms over xenophobia. We move away from that newspaper to the Guardian newspaper. On the Guardian newspaper, the lead page says 40% inaccurate. False lab results worsen sickle cell epidemic pains. You get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. Over 40% inaccurate false lab results has worsened sickle cell epidemic and pains. At the top of that same newspaper, 2027 NDC exempts Obi Kwankwaso from anti-defection oath. You get the full story on page 3 of the newspaper. And the NDC has exempted Peter Obi and Kwankwaso from anti-defection oath. Still in the same newspaper, at the bottom of that particular newspaper, Ekiti election. Over 1 million voters to decide as INEC distributes materials to 16 councils. You get the full story on page 6 of the same newspaper. Then Senate, NDPC push digital economy, amends Cybercrime Act. You get the full story on page 4 of the newspaper. Then still in the same newspaper, violence, insecurity worsening household poverty. Report reviews. Report has revealed that violence and insecurity has worsened household poverty. You get the full story on page 29 of the same newspaper. Expert warns that 30,000 communities risk flooding as NEC approves 83.2 billion naira intervention. You get the full story on page 4 of the newspaper. Then on the Matrix newspaper, still in the Matrix newspaper, this particular story is surfacing again on flooding as NEC okays 83 billion naira intervention package. You get the full story on page 2 of the newspaper. At the top of that newspaper, federal government unveils roadmap for tax reform implementation. Continue reading on page 3 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper on entertainment, emotions high as Abia Nollywood bid Alex Ekubo farewell. Recall that Alex Ekubo died in the month of May 2026, and yesterday happened to be his funeral service, and there was a lot of emotions in Arochukwu, Abia State to be precise, and a lot of Nollywood actors and actresses were there to bid him a farewell. May his soul rest in peace, and condolence to his family and the ones that he has left behind. Still in the same newspaper, by the right of the newspaper on page 2, federal government targets stronger media security agencies partnership to tackle insecurity. So federal governments are targeting stronger media security agencies to partner with them in order to tackle insecurity. Then on page 12 of the same newspaper, Sanwo-Olu orders massive waste evacuation as refuse piles trigger concerns in Lagos State. We move away from that newspaper to the Vanguard newspaper. On the Vanguard newspaper on insecurity, governors seek swift establishment of state police. You get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. Governments have finally approved the state policing, and they are waiting for the swift establishment of this state police. At the top of the newspaper, coming from the federal government report, they stated that over 742 Nigerians in South Africa are to be evacuated before June 30th. You get the full story on page 9 of the newspaper. Then on page 15 of that newspaper, oil slumped to lowest price since US-Iran conflict. Still on the foreign scene on page 9, Middle West war. US lifts Iranian ports blockade as deal comes into force. Then at the bottom of that newspaper, federal government roll out guidelines for transition to new tax regime. You get the full story on page 4 of the newspaper. Then this is coming from Afenifere. He says that insecurity, rising terror attacks threatened democracy. You get the full story on page 37 of the newspaper. Afenifere says that insecurity and current rising terror attacks is threatening democracy. Then the United Union says that 950 rights activists, journalists, unionists killed, disappeared in 2025. You get the full story on page 8 of the newspaper. Federal government has replied to Christians. They say that we hear your security fears. You get the full story on page 8 of the newspaper as well. Federal government says that they have heard the fears of Christians and concerning insecurity. We move away from that newspaper to the Punch newspaper. On the Punch newspaper on bandits attack, federal government raises 500 billion naira emergency security fund. You get the full story on page 2 of the newspaper. Then on page 7 of the newspaper, flood crisis, NEC lashes prevention fund by 50%, approves 80 billion naira. At the right of the newspaper, according to CBN report, fraudsters rake in 134 billion naira from banks and customers. You get the full story on page 18 of the newspaper. Insecurity, APC knocks opposition, rejects Tinubu's resignation call. APC has rejected Tinubu's resignation call by the opposition members. Recall that opposition lawmakers asked President Bola Ahmed Tinubu to either fix insecurity or he steps aside. Now the APC has knocked against that opposition request, and they are refusing President Bola Ahmed Tinubu from resigning. You get the full story on page 8 of the newspaper. We'll move away from that newspaper to the New Telegraph. On the New Telegraph newspaper, still on insecurity, governors finalize preparations for state police, meets with AGF. You get the full story on page 2, 3, 5, 6, and 7 of the newspaper. Finally, the governors has finally agreed on state police, and then they are setting to meet with the AGF. At the top of that newspaper from Cooperative Bank, federal government mobilizes 200 billion naira share capital for takeoff. You get the full story on page 3 of that same newspaper. Then on aviation, federal government promises improve access to aircraft financing. You get the full story on page 25 of the newspaper. Then in the middle of that newspaper, why Carlos' support for Tinubu earns him respect at home and abroad. You get the full story on page 2 and page 28 of the newspaper. Carlos' support for President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has earned him both local and international support. No citizen should be victim of national development, says President Bola Ahmed Tinubu. You get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. The president says that no citizen should be a victim of national development. At the bottom of that newspaper, federal government to evacuate over 742 Nigerians in South Africa before June 30th. You get the full story on page 4 of the newspaper. We'll move away from that newspaper to the Nation newspaper. On the Nation newspaper, DSS has rejected foreign funding for security intelligence gathering. You continue reading on page 5 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper from Kiyamo, he says why government is backing local airlines. You continue reading on page 2 of the newspaper. We must not lower guard in Ebola prevention measures. You continue reading on page 11 of the newspaper. Then at the bottom of that same newspaper, APC targets total sweep of poll in Ekiti. You continue reading on page 2 of the newspaper. Then on page 2 of the newspaper as well, on the foreign scene, blockade of Strait of Hormuz lifted as United States, Iran signed deal to halt war. Finally, Iran and US has finally agreed to stop the endless war. Then we move away from that newspaper to the This Day newspaper. This happened to be the last newspaper for today. With concerns, governors back state police, the man safeguards other proviso. You get the full story on page 8 of the newspaper. At the top of that newspaper, federal government unveils 5-year national regional development policy, says document will guide operations. Federal government unveils 5-year national regional development policy, says documents will guide operations. You continue reading on page 8 of the same newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, federal government releases transition guidelines for 2025 tax act. You continue reading on page 8 of the newspaper. We've come to the end of the newspaper review. Many thanks for watching. I am Kasituni, and do have a beautiful day.